The official Iranian state news agency published a statement at 6:14 in the morning on April 2nd, 2026. It was 47 words long. It said that certain military logistics facilities had sustained minor damage. It named no locations, it listed no casualties, it gave no timeline for restoration, and it was published 11 hours after the events it was describing. 47 words to describe the single most consequential 24-hour period in Iran's military history since the Iran-Iraq War. Not because of what those words said, because of what 47 words, published 11 hours late, tells you about the state of the government issuing them. That is the story from the outside. I am going to show you the story from the inside, because what is happening inside Iran right now, economically, militarily, politically, is a story that is not being told, and it is the story that determines everything that happens next. Let me start with the Isfahan ammunition depot, because it is the clearest window into a problem that extends far beyond a single facility. The secondary explosions burned for 4 hours. 4 hours! That is not a large stockpile. That is a generational stockpile. The kind of accumulation that takes 8 to 12 years of industrial production to assemble, assuming you have uninterrupted supply chains, uninterrupted funding, and uninterrupted manufacturing capacity. Iran had all three of those things until February 2026. It no longer has any of them. Here is the specific number that almost nobody has examined. Iran's domestic defense industrial output, its capacity to manufacture the missiles, the rocket motors, the guidance components that fill depots like Isfahan, currently operates at an estimated 34% of its pre-conflict capacity. That figure comes from cross-referencing 3 sources: U.S. Treasury secondary sanctions designations filed between January and March 2026, satellite imagery of Iran's primary defense manufacturing complexes at Parchin, Semnan, and Khorramabad, and the import disruption data for precision machining components that Iran's missile program depends on. 34%. That means for every 3 missiles Iran fires or loses to a U.S. strike, it can currently manufacture approximately 1 replacement. And here is what that ratio means in practice. Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force entered this conflict with an estimated strategic reserve of 3,000 to 3,500 ballistic missiles across all categories. The strikes on Isfahan, Parchin, and 3 additional hardened storage complexes in Khuzestan province have, according to open-source damage assessment compiled from commercial satellite imagery, degraded that reserve by somewhere between 18% and 26%. Call it 700 missiles. Destroyed. Not expended in combat. Destroyed in storage, along with the infrastructure required to maintain, transport, and launch the remaining inventory. You cannot rebuild 700 missiles in a month. You cannot rebuild them in a year at 34% manufacturing capacity with a component supply chain that has been systematically disrupted by the most aggressive secondary sanctions regime the United States has ever applied to a single country's defense industrial base. The strategic missile reserve that Iran spent a decade assembling is not being replenished. It is being consumed. Here is the number I want you to sit with. The Iranian rial has lost 61% of its value against the US dollar since the first US airstrikes on Iranian territory in February 2026. 61% in 11 weeks. To put that in terms that mean something concrete, a family in Tehran that had saved the equivalent of $10,000 worth of rials before February now holds the equivalent of $3,900. Their savings did not disappear because of a missile. Their savings disappeared because the government that manages the currency they saved in is visibly losing a war. Iran's central bank has spent an estimated $14 billion in foreign currency reserves attempting to stabilize the rial since February. Its total foreign currency reserve before this conflict began was approximately $60 billion, a number that was already depleted from sanctions pressure. At the current burn rate, the central bank has between 14 and 18 weeks of intervention capacity remaining before it can no longer defend the currency at all. After that point, the rial does not decline further. It ceases to function as a reliable medium of exchange.
The social consequence of that is not abstract. Iran imports approximately 30% of its basic food supply. Wheat, cooking oil, animal feed, medicine, all of it is priced in dollars. All of it becomes more expensive in direct proportion to rial devaluation. The food inflation rate inside Iran is currently running at an annualized rate of 118%. That is not a statistic. That is a family standing in a market in Mashhad or Avaz calculating whether they can afford bread this week. That calculation is being made by tens of millions of people simultaneously, and it is producing a political pressure that no government, regardless of its ideological commitments, can sustain indefinitely.
The Islamic Republic has survived sanctions before. It survived the 2012 oil embargo. It survived the maximum pressure campaign of 2018 to 2021. But it survived those episodes with its military infrastructure intact, its missile stockpiles undiminished, and its domestic population angry, but not yet watching state television report 47-word statements about facilities that burned for 4 hours. Here is the specific detail that almost no mainstream outlet has taken time to examine. Because when you examine it, the entire shape of this story changes. Within 72 hours of the Isfahan strike, 3 members of Iran's Supreme National Security Council submitted formal written objections to the continued ballistic missile campaign against Israeli civilian infrastructure. Those objections were not made public by Iranian state media. They were reported by 2 independent Persian-language outlets operating outside Iran, and subsequently corroborated by a Wall Street Journal source briefed on internal Iranian deliberations. 3 council members, not reformists, not opposition figures, members of the security apparatus itself, arguing internally that the current military strategy is consuming irreplaceable resources in exchange for strategic gains that cannot be clearly defined. This matters in a specific and measurable way. The Islamic Republic's system of governance has maintained internal cohesion through 45 years of external pressure by maintaining a unified front within the security establishment. The moment that front cracks, not publicly, not visibly, but internally, in written objections filed by Security Council members, the decision-making architecture that has allowed Iran to absorb decades of external pressure without changing course begins to change from the inside. There is a second fracture line that deserves equal attention. Iran's IRGC and its conventional military, the Artesh, have operated with a deliberately managed tension between them for decades. The IRGC receives the funding, the prestige, and the strategic mission. The Artesh defends borders, maintains order, and largely watches. In the current conflict, it is IRGC facilities that are being struck, IRGC stockpiles that are burning, IRGC commanders who are being held accountable for a missile campaign that is costing far more than it is delivering. And the Artesh, which has not been the primary target of U.S. strikes, is watching that happen. What that imbalance produces over time is not loyalty. It is institutional resentment, carefully concealed, accumulating in the dark. Iran does not have a clean move here. I mean that with precision. Both available paths lead to the same destination by different routes. Option 1. Continue the missile campaign. Demonstrate to the domestic population and to proxy allies that Iran will not back down under military pressure. The cost of this approach is not measured in dollars, though those costs are real. It is measured in the rate at which the strategic missile reserve approaches zero. At current expenditure and manufacturing rates, Iran's operational ballistic missile inventory reaches a level insufficient to sustain a multi-front campaign in approximately 7 to 9 months. After that point, the threat that has defined Iran's deterrence posture for 2 decades becomes a diminishing asset. Every missile fired is a missile that cannot be replaced on any timeline that matters to this conflict. Option 2. Accept a ceasefire on terms that fall short of what Iranian leadership has publicly committed to. Stop the depletion. Preserve what remains of the missile inventory. Allow the economy to begin stabilizing. The cost of this approach is not military. It is political. Iran's government has told its population and the governments of its proxy allies across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen that it will not yield. Accepting a ceasefire that does not include a complete halt to Israeli military operations or a firm commitment on Palestinian statehood is not described as a negotiated outcome within Iran's political vocabulary. It is described as surrender. And governments that surrender in wars they started do not typically survive the peace. Option 1 consumes the military capacity that makes Iran a regional power. Option 2 consumes the political legitimacy that makes the government a functioning government. Neither option preserves what existed before February 2026. The Islamic Republic is not facing a military problem with a military solution, or a political problem with a political solution. It is facing both simultaneously, and the resource available to solve one is the resource being consumed to survive the other. The 47-word statement released at 6:14 in the morning was not an oversight. Governments that are managing well do not release 47-word statements about 4-hour explosions. They release detailed technical briefings designed to demonstrate control. The brevity is the data. The silence is the story. And the story it is telling, if you know how to read it, is that the government issuing it does not fully know what it lost that night, or knows exactly what it lost and has calculated that telling its own people is more dangerous than the loss itself. Here is my question for you in the comments. If Iran's leadership reaches the point where continuing the war destroys the military and stopping it destroys the government, which do you think they choose? And what does your answer reveal about what this region looks like in 18 months? I read every comment. The strongest ones I address directly in a follow-up. Source documents including U.S. Treasury secondary sanctions filings, commercial satellite imagery from Maxar and Planet Labs, and Persian language reporting from outlets operating outside Iran are linked in the description. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Subscribe. There is more coming. This is War Conflict.